The Dating Game Killer by Hollywood and Crime contains depictions of violence and is not suitable for everyone. Please be advised.
In the spring of 1972, Rodney Alcala was safely in custody for the attack on Tally Shapiro. But LA prosecutors were having problems building their case against him. Tally's family had relocated to Mexico and would not return to the States for the trial. It was understandable they would not want to revisit the trauma inflicted upon the 8-year-old. But without Tally as a witness to give her account to the jury, the impact of the assault wouldn't be as powerful. No doctor's description of the violence done to her could match her first-hand account. The DA was unwilling to risk a jury trial. Despite the seriousness of the offense, the kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder of a child, prosecutors agreed to let Alcala plead guilty to the reduced charge of child molestation. On May 19, 1972, he was sentenced to serve the indeterminate sentence of from 1 year to life. It would depend on the parole board to determine when the convict was sufficiently rehabilitated to be returned to society, or on his ability to convince them he was. Prisoner Rodney James Alcala knew he needed to create a new compliant persona to ensure his stay within the California penal system would be as short as possible. Fortunately, there were a multitude of educational, vocational, and self-help services he could sign up for in prison to help him do just that. Of most interest to the convicted sex predator were the therapy sessions designed to cure him of his violent and pedophiliac urges. Alcala proved himself a quick learner. He attended classes and engaged with instructors and fellow inmates. He borrowed books from the prison library and quickly adopted the terminology of the self-improvement industry. He could repeat it back to prison doctors at will. He created no problems for the staff and was considered a model prisoner in every respect. Thus, in August 1974, just over 2 years after his conviction, a newly minted and self-improved Rodney presented himself to a prison psychiatrist to make his case for parole. Engaging and relaxed, he described his acts of 6 years earlier as those of a former self, whose skin he had shed completely. He gave generous thanks to the psychiatrist for the deep introspection that therapy had allowed him. The new Rodney was mortified by what he had done and deeply contrite. The psychiatrist asked many questions, trained to look for signs of deception. But the patient inmate who sat before him was self-assured and forthright, made whole again through the therapeutic process. He had turned himself into a better Rodney Alcala, fixed in his determination to be a positive influence on society. The psychiatrist was impressed. He reported to the parole board that Rodney was considerably improved and recommended him for probation. The board agreed and granted parole to Alcala on condition he register with the Monterey Park Police Department as a sex offender. Including his time in custody prior to his plea, Alcala would spend 2 years and 3 months of his 1 year to life sentence for the assault on Tally Shapiro. By the end of August, he was a free man. We are pleased to have
In Wondery's new podcast, Killer Psyche, retired FBI criminal profiler Candice DeLong dissects the thoughts and motivations of the most infamous felons in history. With a career spanning nearly 5 decades, she sat across the table from hundreds of criminals. Follow Killer Psyche on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you're listening right now.
Okay, Arisha, I want to tell you a story.
Okay, I'm pulling up my weighted blanket.
Okay, once upon a time, there was a young woman with hair as black as ebony and eyes the color of violets.
And her name was Snow White.
And her name was Elizabeth Taylor. And instead of 7 dwarves, our leading lady has 7 husbands, plus the best jewelry collection you've ever seen. Listen to the life and loves of Elizabeth Taylor on Even the Rich on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, the Wondery app, or wherever you're listening right now. Join Wondery Plus in the Wondery app to listen ad-free.
From Wondery, this is Hollywood and Crime. I'm Tracy Patton with Stephen Lang. If you're joining us for the first time, we recommend you go back and listen to the previous episode. This is episode 2, Rehabilitated.
On the morning of October 13, 1974, 13-year-old Julie Johnson waits for her school bus to arrive at its stop at the Huntington Beach Shopping Center. Carrying an armload of books, she shifts on her feet impatiently. She glances up as a blue station wagon pulls up at the curb in front of her. A man leans across the front seat toward the passenger window. "Need a ride?" he asks, flashing a wide smile. Julie ignores him, knowing better than to talk to strangers. "I can drive you to school if you want, Julie," he offers. For a moment, she's taken aback. How does this guy know her name? Then she realizes Julie is written on her books in giant letters. She looks back down the road but sees no sign of the bus. The man slides across the seat to the passenger window. He's got long curly hair and a toothy grin. He tells her he's a photographer, holding up an expensive-looking camera. He says he's got some cool posters, if she's interested in that kind of thing. Julie hesitates, but she's getting tired of waiting for the bus. Concerned she might be late for class, she gives the man another look. He seems okay. Anyway, what kind of dangerous guy would be driving around in a station wagon? It looks like his mother's car. And she'd kind of like to see these posters he keeps talking about. With a last glance down the road and no sign of the approaching bus, she grabs the door handle. The man slides back behind the wheel as she gets into the passenger seat. He tells her his name is John Ronald and asks how old she is. He's surprised to learn she's 13, skinny and undeveloped. She looks closer to 9 or 10. She asks about the posters he promised to show her, and he tells her they're in the trunk. After a few minutes, she points up ahead. That's my school. But he keeps driving toward Pacific Coast Highway, as if he didn't hear her. She asks him loudly to pull the car over, but he ignores her, staring straight ahead. Now she's getting scared. He seems lost in his own world, acting as if she's not there no matter what she says or does. Finally, John Ronald says they need to stop off at his apartment for something. Maybe it's the poster, she thinks, and it'll be okay after all. But no, this is starting to feel really weird. When the car slows in traffic, she reaches for the door handle, but he grabs her arm. He looks at her, and his face is twisted, scary. Then suddenly, his voice turns soft and friendly again. He tells her he just wants to show her this beautiful spot overlooking the ocean. In a few moments, the car pulls over near the bluffs above Bolsa Chica State Park. He kills the engine, gets out, and moves around the car quickly to her side. He opens the door and pulls her out. It's okay, he keeps saying, though his grip on her arm is tight enough to hurt. When they reach the cliff's edge, he forces her down onto a large rock and sits beside her. You get high? He asks, his voice now friendly again. She nods, though it's a lie. She doesn't want him to think she's a little kid. He pulls a joint out of his pocket and lights it, taking a deep draw and handing it to her. She tries to inhale the harsh smoke, but ends up coughing most of it up. I thought you said you get high, he smirks. Then he suddenly pulls her to him and kisses her roughly. When she tries to push him away, he teases her about not liking boys. Now panicked, she looks around at the deserted bluff. There's nowhere to escape, no one to hear her if she cries out. For the first time, Julie thinks she's going to die.
If he hadn't looked up at just the right moment, Park Ranger Jim Montgomery might never have noticed the two figures sitting on a rock outcropping at the edge of the cliff. There was nothing suspicious in that. The state park was sparsely populated on a weekday, but the occasional hiker wasn't unusual. Still, the area was frequently the site of minor transgressions, usually no more than kids ditching school on a nice day. Drug use was common, though, and it was Ranger Montgomery's job to keep an eye out for it. As he approached the couple from behind, his instincts were confirmed. Even from a distance, he could smell the acrid, sweet marijuana smoke wafting toward him as it dissipated in the mild sea breeze. "What are you folks up to?" he asked, coming up behind them. The man turned around, startled, but quickly regrouped. They'd been out for a hike, he told the ranger, and were just taking a break. The girl, who looked about 10, immediately jumped up and blurted out that she'd been kidnapped. The man tried to make light of it, explaining that the girl had gotten hold of some pot and suggested they go off and get high together. She was lying now because she was afraid of what her parents would say. Ranger Montgomery wasn't sure what to make of the strange duo. He decided to take them both in and sort out who was telling the truth. At the Huntington Beach police station, officers ran a background check on the man, who now gave his name as Rodney Alcala. Within moments, they learned this was no innocent outing in the park or minor drug offense. Alcala was a convicted sex offender and current parolee. His prior victim, also a young girl, had been lured into his car before he sexually assaulted her. Alcala was immediately arrested and charged with kidnapping, the sale of drugs, and parole violation. 2.5 months later, he was convicted of violating parole and providing drugs to a minor. He was sent back to prison to serve his time at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. By now, it was familiar territory to prisoner Alcala, and he knew how to work the system.
The California Men's Colony considers itself a model institution for rehabilitation, offering an array of self-help programs geared toward reintroducing inmates into society. Again, Rodney Alcala excels in his studies and demonstrates to staff and doctors that he's a changed man. After spending less than 3 years in prison for parole violation and giving drugs to a minor, he is up for parole. Again, he is assessed reformed and found appropriate for release. The only condition is that he report in once a week. Within a month, he has convinced his parole officer that a change of scenery will do him good. He is granted permission to take a brief vacation in New York to visit relatives. The New York of 1977 is a different city from the one John Berger experienced during his NYU years. Absent are the beaded hippies and mini-skirted teeny boppers that flooded into the village on the weekends. Gone are the striking musical acts that gave Manhattan its flavor and a youth movement its soul. There is less talk of the coming age of Aquarius and more concern over crime. Most recently, a spate of homicides committed with a .44 caliber handgun has New Yorkers on edge. Young women are warned against going out at night. Many cut their long dark hair to avoid looking like the victims the killer seems to target. Couples stay away from known lovers' lanes, don't engage in make-out sessions and park cars on dark streets. The murderer plays a cat-and-mouse game with police, sending cryptic messages through the press. In a rambling block-printed letter found near the bodies of two victims, he rants about the evil mastermind who keeps him locked in an attic. From then on, the .44 caliber killer is known as the Son of Sam. Rodney's July 13th arrival is almost simultaneous with a lightning strike at a power plant on the Hudson River north of the city. Within an hour, the 5 boroughs are plunged into darkness for over 24 hours. A hot, miserable summer culminates in a peak of civic rage as looting and vandalism break out in poor neighborhoods. Hundreds of fires are set. Cars are stolen from dealerships, and steel grates ripped from storefronts to gain access to high-end electronics. The price of flashlights skyrockets as hardware store owners attempt to take advantage of the situation. By the time the lights are back on, over 1,600 businesses have been damaged or destroyed. Almost 3,800 people have been arrested. A day after the blackout, Manhattan life is returning to normal. Recent college grad Ellen Hover is again free to wander the streets of the city. The daughter of Herman Hover, owner of Ciro's legendary nightclub, Ellen spent her early years in the company of Hollywood royalty. Mickey Rooney, Lucille Ball, Cary Grant, and Marilyn Monroe were regulars at the club. Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. are her godfathers. Following her mother's divorce, she relocated to New York, where she grew into a gifted pianist and aspiring orchestra conductor before settling into her own apartment on 3rd Avenue in Midtown. A visit to the 42nd Street Library is routine, and on her way home she stops off for groceries. Closing the front door behind her, she puts the bags on the kitchen counter, returns to the living room, and kicks off her shoes. She has a lunch appointment, then dinner with a college friend, but the rest of her morning is free. She turns on the television and relaxes into the sofa. Just after noon, there's a knock at her door. Ellen looks through the peephole. It's her lunch date, the man she met on the street the other day, with the long ponytail and easy charm. He told her he was a photographer and held up his camera as if to prove it. He told Ellen he enjoyed taking pictures around the city, mainly of people. Told her she was pretty and would make an excellent subject. Ellen said she'd think about it, then decided maybe a lunch would be okay. Now here he is, grinning into the peephole, holding up the camera. She opens the door and lets him in.
In the aftermath of a shocking crime, people always ask why. Who would do something like that? Was it about power, ego, revenge? What makes people like that tick? In Wondery's new podcast, Killer Psyche, retired FBI criminal profiler Candace DeLong dissects the thoughts and motivations of the most infamous felons in history. With a career spanning nearly 5 decades, she sat across the table from hundreds of criminals and spent countless hours inside their minds. In every episode of Killer Psyche, Candace will unravel the psychology and instincts of America's most complex and disturbing figures, including high-profile cases that she personally worked on, like the Unabomber, and other cases like Christopher Dunch, a.k.a. Dr. Death, where her training and experience can help us understand what was going on inside his head. Was he delusional or a cold-blooded killer? To hear the gripping details of the most chilling criminals' minds in modern history, follow Killer Psyche on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or you can listen to new episodes early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app. Even before they stopped the patrol car, both LAPD officers had the same thought. Another one. By November 10th, 1977, the corpses of 3 young women had been found in the hills around Los Angeles. This morning, the call had come in about a dead body on Franklin Canyon Drive off Mulholland. Like the others, she'd been posed. She was young, perhaps late teens or 20s. She would have stood under 5 feet tall and weighed 95 pounds. Authorities were familiar with the M.O. Everything about the crime, the rape, torture, manner of death, outdoor disposal, and posing of the body, pointed to the predator and sexual sadist who had been abducting and murdering young women over the past several weeks. By now, they recognized his work. In the fall of 1977, Los Angeles had been rocked by a series of murders as prolific as they were savage. Every few days, it seemed another corpse would turn up. All the bodies had been posed, apparently for maximum lurid and horrific effect. Within weeks, the city was on the alert for what looked like a new serial killer. Authorities surmised the women had been murdered elsewhere before being discarded on the hills around LA. The newspapers soon dubbed the killer the Hillside Strangler. Across the continent, NYPD detectives were faced with a disappearance more difficult to classify. When 23-year-old socialite Ellen Hover went missing in July, it didn't fit the MO of their high-profile killer, the son of Sam, who shot his victims and left them at the scene. Then on August 10th, postal worker David Berkowitz was arrested for the crimes and the murder spree ended. By fall, there was still no sign of Ellen Hover. Only a day after the blackout, she had missed a dinner engagement with a friend who had tried calling her with no response. Later that night, when she missed her nightly call to her mother, her parents were only mildly concerned. It wasn't until the next day, when Ellen still hadn't called and wasn't answering her phone, that they called the police. When officers arrived at Ellen's apartment, they knocked but got no response. There appeared to be no signs of forced entry. Gaining access to the apartment, they entered and found nothing out of the ordinary. The young woman just seemed to have vanished. One of the officers noticed a calendar on the wall. There was an entry in the box for July 15th, the previous day. It was the date Ellen had gone missing. The entry read, John Berger, photographer.
Rodney Alcala sits in the personnel department of the Los Angeles Times. He smiles affably and slides his resume across the table to the supervisor. By fall of 1977, Alcala has returned to Los Angeles after his brief stay in New York. He's resettled in his mother's house in Monterey Park, 10 minutes east of downtown. With no legal requirements beyond his weekly visits to his parole officer, he begins looking for work. His ambition is to be a professional photographer, but until he can make that happen, he decides to apply for a typesetter job at the Times. At least he'll be in a workplace where he can make contacts who might appreciate his true talents. The supervisor glances down at the applicant's resume. It's a fabric of lies, including positions at companies in New York and Connecticut. There's no mention of serving 3 years for the attack on Tally Shapiro or the recent prison stint on drug charges and parole violation. Rather, Alcala presents a picture of confidence and competence. With a modest shrug, he tells his interviewer that he hopes one day he might be considered for a position as staff photographer. Well, that remains to be seen, the supervisor tells him with a smile, but he is more than qualified for the job he's seeking. The Times does not run a background check on its new hire, nor does the paper bother to check his references or past job experience. The man who once graced the FBI's most wanted list begins a career at the fourth largest newspaper in the United States.
LAPD detectives took less than 24 hours to identify the body found brutalized and posed in the Hollywood Hills. Fingerprints from a juvenile arrest revealed she was 18-year-old Jill Barcombe of Oneida, New York. She had arrived in Los Angeles only last month after taking the cross-country trip in a van with several friends. Authorities were proceeding on the assumption that this was the work of the Hillside Strangler, whose rampage continued unabated. 3 days later, on November 13th, 2 middle school students disappeared after getting off an RTD bus. Their decomposing bodies were found a week later in a trash heap on a hill overlooking Dodger Stadium. On November 18th, the nude body of a high schooler bearing the 5-point ligature marks of other Strangler victims was found in the Wilshire district. 2 days later, a 20-year-old honors student at Pasadena's Art Center College of Design was found on a hillside between Glendale and Eagle Rock. The cruelty of the attacks would only increase when on November 29th, the body of an 18-year-old business student would be found with burn marks on her hands. This time, however, there was a witness to the apparent abduction. A neighbor reported seeing 2 men, one tall and young, the other older with bushy hair. This comported with a theory investigators were developing. The victims appeared to have been killed elsewhere and then brought to the dump sites. The remote locations often involved difficult maneuvering, which led detectives to think there might be 2 Hillside Stranglers. It wasn't until February 17th that the last body in the grisly series would be found in the trunk of a car abandoned near the Angeles Crest Highway. The victim would turn out to be the car's owner, Cindy Hudspeth. When a murderous rampage as prolific as that of the Hillside Stranglers ends abruptly, authorities often conjecture that the perpetrators have either died, been incarcerated on some other drug charge, or moved on to a new locale. When young Jill Barcombe's body had been discovered on November 10th in the hills off Mulholland Drive, she'd been filed away as one of a long string of Hillside Strangler victims. With home security, there are 2 ways you can go about protecting your home. There's the traditional way, where you wait weeks for a technician to do a messy installation that costs a small fortune. Or there's the other way, our sponsor, SimpliSafe. Simply Safe is everything you need in a home security system, blanketing your whole home in safety. It truly is comprehensive protection for your entire home. Outdoor cameras and doorbells alert you to anyone approaching your home. Entry, motion, and glass break sensors guard inside. But what's truly remarkable is you can set up this system all by yourself. I thought it would be complicated, but if I did it, anyone can do it. It takes 30 minutes to an hour tops, and just like that, you'll have an army of highly trained security experts ready to dispatch police to your home at a moment's notice 24/7. Go to simplysafe.com/datinggame today, and you'll get free shipping and a 60-day risk-free trial. Be sure to go to simplysafe.com/datinggame so they know we sent you. That's simplysafe.com/datinggame.
Picture this. You're Elizabeth Taylor, all dressed in white, walking down the aisle. You're also just 18 years old, but you're already one of the most famous movie stars in the world. You have a talent for becoming the characters you're playing, and today is no different.
So this is a wedding scene in a movie?
No, this is a real-life wedding, but every detail has been chosen by MGM. The dress, the flowers, the groom.
Wait, what?
Yeah, in the Hollywood studio system, arranged marriages are a fact of life. And today, Elizabeth will either have to say I do to her groom or say I don't to her career.
Ooh, that's a tough choice. What does she do?
Well, she pulls a move I didn't see coming. But to find out what happens next, you'll have to listen to the newest season of Even the Rich, The Life and Loves of Elizabeth Taylor. Follow on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, the Wondery app, or wherever you're listening right now. Join Wondery Plus and the Wondery app to listen ad-free.
Rodney Alcala thrives in his new job as typesetter at the LA Times. He engages with his fellow employees, sharing tales of his adventures in New York. Above all, he's eager to show off his photographs, telling all who will listen that his real aim is to be a professional photographer. If anyone finds it odd that his shots are almost exclusively of young girls, no one mentions it. He's considered outgoing and friendly, often regaling his co-workers with details of the last high-end Hollywood party he attended and which celebrities he met. To his colleagues, he presents the image of a man with a bright future. When he isn't at work or hobnobbing at the disco, he's at the beach, taking photos of young women and teens in their skimpy bathing attire. Considered rehabilitated by the prison system, he hasn't lost his interest in underage girls, though he claims it's only for the sake of his art. It isn't until late in the year that his past makes a reappearance in his present. On December 11th, 1977, Alcala is brought downtown for questioning in a 5-month-old missing persons case. The FBI has contacted LAPD regarding the July disappearance of Ellen Hover in New York. The John Berger mentioned on Hover's calendar turned out to be one Rodney Alcala, sex predator and twice-convicted felon, currently residing with his mother in Monterey Park, California. Alcala readily admits having spent time with Ellen during his brief stay in New York over the summer. He tells the investigators the two met while he was taking pictures on Manhattan's Upper East Side. In fact, he saw her on the date of her disappearance. They traveled to a favorite scenic spot of his in Westchester, where he took photos of her. After the session, they returned to the city, and he dropped her off at her apartment building. Alcala returned to LA only days later, and he's had no contact with her since. When the investigators ask if he's willing to take a lie detector, the affable person of interest politely declines, giving no reason. Alcala is let go. Though authorities believe Ellen is dead, she's still officially considered a missing person. Without a body, there's no proof a crime has been committed. Her connection with a known sex predator raises the investigators' level of interest in Rodney Alcala, a.k.a. John Berger. But there's little they can do until they find Ellen Hover.
On the late afternoon of December 16th, the LA Sheriff's Office received a call from Barbara Gale, a clerk at Centinela Hospital in Inglewood. Barbara was concerned that her friend and co-worker, cardiac nurse Georgia Wickstead, hadn't shown up for work that day. 2 women had celebrated a friend's birthday the night before at Brennan's Pub in Marina del Rey. Georgia had dropped Barbara off at her Santa Monica home at just after 2 a.m. When Georgia failed to show up at Barbara's place to drive her to work the next morning, as was their custom, Barbara assumed her friend had overslept. But after repeated calls to Georgia's apartment went unanswered, Barbara grew worried and called the sheriff's office. Deputies were dispatched to the 2-story building on Pacific Coast Highway. As they entered the courtyard and approached apartment 8, they noticed that one of the window screens was missing. A box was positioned underneath, as if to give someone a step up to climb through the window. The officers knocked loudly on the front door several times, but no one answered. When they tried the doorknob, they found the apartment unlocked. Announcing themselves as sheriff's deputies, they entered the premises. Immediately, they saw a dead body lying on the floor. After quickly checking for potential assailants or perhaps more victims, they called homicide. Blood and DNA evidence were collected at the scene, though without a suspect or criminal database, they could not be put to use. Most of the injuries suffered by Georgia Wickstead had been endured while she was alive.
In Los Angeles, a killer the police are calling the Hillside Strangler has murdered 10 young women and left their bodies on the hillside.
Like anyone living in L.A. in early 1978, Rodney Alcala has heard of the Hillside Strangler. It's hard to watch a TV news report or crack a newspaper without hearing of yet another body or getting details of the latest phase of the police investigation. They left bodies in their wake for over 3 months, sometimes several in 1 week. Though a few of the first victims were prostitutes, it soon became clear that the killers targeted anyone demonstrating a moment's vulnerability or naivete. The victims included schoolgirls, college students, young professionals. They might be alone or in pairs. Anyone's wife or girlfriend, daughter or sister, friend or co-worker might be next. Rodney Alcala greets the detectives affably on the morning of March 22nd when they show up at his mother's house. He tells them he understands why they need to check him out. As a registered sex offender and twice-convicted felon, it's only natural he would be on their radar in the recent spate of killings. He's happy to sit down with them and go over his whereabouts when the Hillside Strangler crimes were being committed. And he has ready answers for all the dates and times in question. If anything, detectives note, he has a remarkable memory for where he was at such and such a time on such and such a day. Some of his alibis are easily corroborated. He was at work or with witnesses who can back him up. And if his alibis are good for most of the murders, investigators reason, they're likely good for all of them, since it's believed the crimes were committed by the same individual or individuals. But the parolee isn't entirely in the clear. Before leaving, the officer spots some marijuana and take him in on drug possession charges. Rodney Alcala is headed back to jail.
The pounding was loud enough to startle building manager Hector Diaz and his wife Flora as they sat down to breakfast on the morning of June 24th. When they rushed to the front door, they found one of their tenants shaking and yelling incoherently. This clearly wasn't about a leaky faucet or blown fuse. When the tenant finally managed to sputter out the words, "Dead body," Diaz ran out of the apartment, his wife only a beat behind. The tenant led them to the ground floor laundry room and they stopped in the doorway. Hector's first impulse was to see if there was anything they could do, but Flora shook her head. From her years working as a nurse, she recognized the undeniable signs of death. The woman's body was sprawled on the floor, covered in blood. Homicide detectives from L.A. County Sheriff's Office arrived at the El Segundo apartment complex a little before noon. Investigators gathered evidence and the body of the unknown woman was taken away for autopsy. Within hours, the medical examiner reported that death had been by strangulation. The victim's face and head had suffered repeated blunt force impacts, presumably from the piece of wood found near the body. Bruising and lacerations indicated she'd been raped, perhaps with an object. Sperm was recovered, but there was no database for purposes of comparison. Though the brutality of the crime and posing of the body were consistent with the Hillside Stranglers, investigators felt confident another perpetrator was responsible. Not only was the disposal of the body different from the MO that gave the killers their name, no victims had been discovered since Cindy Hudspeth was found in the trunk of her car in February, and it was nearly July. Thinking within law enforcement was that those responsible for the Strangler killings had moved on or been apprehended for unrelated crimes, which presented an even more chilling idea. Over the last decade, Southern California had seen its share of death at the hands of a breed of criminal newly labeled serial killer. Skid Row slasher Vaughn Greenwood had claimed the lives of 9 Los Angeles transients. Freeway killer William Bonin had raped and murdered at least 21 young men before being caught. And Golden State killer Joseph D'Angelo would go on to rape more than 50 women, killing at least 13. If the Hillside Stranglers weren't responsible for the Jane Doe found in El Segundo, the police had to contend with the possibility that the Southland was now the hunting ground for yet another predator. Next time on The Dating Game Killer. A year after her disappearance, New York detectives continue to search for Ellen Hover. Meanwhile, with the Hillside Strangler behind bars, detectives in L.A. try to figure out who killed Jill Barcombe. And Rodney Alcala appears on The Dating Game and channels his anger into other abductions when his date with the Bachelorette is canceled. This is episode 2 of 6 of The Dating Game Killer from Hollywood and Crime. If you like what you've been hearing, be sure to tell your friends and fans of true crime. We're counting on you to help us spread the word. The Dating Game Killer was written and directed by Larry Brand and produced by Rebecca Reynolds, Tracy Patton, and Jim Carpenter for Hollywood and Crime. Recorded by Julian Nicholson. Edited and designed by Eric Cifuentes and Julian Nicholson. And mixed by Mark Holden for the Invisible Studios, West Hollywood. Executive producers Marshall Louis, Stephanie Jens, and Hernan Lopez.
Hey, I'm Mike Corey, the host of Wandery's show, Against the Odds. In our next season, I'm telling an amazing true story about American sailors who wrecked their ship off the coast of Africa in 1815. They're captured by a nomadic tribe. To escape, they will need to cross the largest hot desert in the world to reach civilization. They will battle against blistering heat, inhumane conditions, hunger, and thirst. Their heroic fight to get home will have a much greater impact than just on their own lives. It will influence a future president and change the course of American history in ways that are still felt today. This is the true story of the men who made it, and it's one that you don't want to miss. Subscribe to Against the Odds on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, the Wondery app, or wherever you're listening right now.